We have four presenters. Each will have 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. And we'll get started right away. Our first presenter is Professor Jonathan Brockopp. Professor Brockopp is Professor of Religious Studies and History at Penn State University. His primary research focus is on the literary remains of early Islamic cultures, including the Quran, Hadith, legal, and theological texts. He's also interested in modern discussions of war, bioethics, economic justice, etc. He has pursued an active interest in these contemporary issues, including the impact of climate change on Muslim communities. And as you may have heard, he was originally planning to do this on Zoom anyway, so this is perfect. So I'd like to turn it over to Professor Brockopp.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. And thanks to you and to the staff for putting this all together. I know it's not easy. I also want to thank the panelists from the first session. I really enjoyed your presentations. I'm not going to try to do a PowerPoint. I'm just going to read my paper. So hopefully we can get this done in 15 minutes. So as some of you know, my main scholarly research is on early Islamic legal manuscripts. And until maybe about 10 years ago, I regarded climate change as a scientific or a policy issue, one that would be addressed and resolved by bureaucrats, much as they have dealt with leaded gas, the ozone hole, acid rain, and other threats to the atmosphere. But the more I read about climate change, the more I realized that scientists and policymakers have been trying to raise the alarm for many decades, going all the way back to the Johnson administration. In fact, President Johnson addressed Congress in 1965 saying, "This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through radioactive materials and a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels," 1965. The National Academy of Scientists made a definitive finding in 1979, and George H.W. Bush promised action on climate change and got the US Senate to ratify the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, in 1992. Yet, here we are. In 2020, facing predicted climate disasters on a nearly daily basis, with no national plan and an international plan in tatters. In such a situation, even those of us who prefer the 9th century to the 21st century must raise our voices, because very few people understand that the choices we make in the next decade will reverberate for literally centuries. Once the permafrost melts and releases its methane, we cannot put it back. Once the Thwaites Glacier slides into the ocean and raises sea levels by about 10 feet, it will not be replenished. Therefore, the focus of this paper is on how we can engage our students, colleagues, and communities, and how opening a conversation on climate change in the Muslim world provides new insights and new possible solutions. Climate change now appears in almost every class I teach. In modern Middle East history, I include a section on climate threats in the Middle East. When teaching bioethics, I have a week on climate and public health. I even developed an entirely new course on the ethics of climate change. And I'm pushing for an interdisciplinary minor in climate studies. I've also been involved both in efforts to drive Penn State University to adopt zero carbon goals and in organizing a community conversation project that seeks to bridge the divide between Penn State and our neighbors in rural central Pennsylvania. As you may be aware, there is a deep skepticism, even a fear of academic expertise in much of the rural United States. But there's also deep knowledge and respect for the frailty of the land. Penn State is well known as home to some of the top climate scientists in the world, but I argue that humanities scholars and ethicists in particular are essential to addressing the climate crisis, because one of the things that makes climate change such an intractable problem is that both the causes and the solutions are tied up with deeply unjust social structures. For example, the emissions that cause climate change are produced by a small sliver of the human population, while the vast majority contributes little to the problem. Indeed, a recent Oxfam study suggested that half the world's population uses only 10% of fossil fuels, and the poorest 1/4, almost 2 billion people, burns almost no fossil fuels at all. Climate change also tracks along racial and colonialist structures, since the main beneficiaries of this fossil fuel use have been white North Americans and Europeans, while Black and brown people, even those in first world countries, are suffering the most. This deep inequality is also partly between the non-Muslim and the Muslim world. But it's found within the Dar al-Islam as well, where a few countries have astonishingly high per capita rates of fossil fuel use. How is ski Dubai a thing? While others barely use any. Similarly, some majority Muslim countries face imminent and even existential threats. Island nations such as the Maldives and the Comoros Islands, river deltas in Egypt, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, while others are currently able to manage the changes they experience. One would hope that wealthy Muslim countries, particularly those that have made their fortunes extracting and selling fossil fuels, would do more. But among majority Muslim countries, the only public contributor to the UNFCCC's Green Climate Fund, for example, is Indonesia. Public statements about what Islam says on climate change rarely take these inequities into account, focusing more on individual rather than on corporate responsibility. Authoritative statements from the Quran and Prophet Muhammad are inspiring, and I really learned a lot from our panelists this morning. But I want to encourage more focus on action, and therefore more attention to central ethical legal principles such as maslahah, public good, karama, human dignity, and siyasa, good governance. The hour is upon us, and so it is time, as the Prophet Muhammad said, channeling rabbinic wisdom, to get our hands dirty and plant some trees. So I want to focus on action and focusing on examples of responding to climate change in the Muslim world. I find is a way to break down, humanize, and internationalize the challenge of climate change. Important and inspiring developments in Muslim countries also help to reverse the narrative of US and corporate intransigence, demonstrating how much of the world has already moved toward implementing climate solutions. For example, numerous majority Muslim countries are sponsoring audacious adaptation and mitigation projects, supported by the Green Climate Fund and other agencies, resulting in important shifts away from fossil fuel infrastructure. I emphasize the Green Climate Fund because it represents one of the most important developments arising out of the UNFCCC, to which, again, the US is an official signatory with treaty obligations. The Green Climate Fund is based on several important principles that ensure its work is effective and transformative. And I just note here, by the way, that these principles are some of the very things that have been mentioned in discussions both of Pope Francis as well as Muslim responses to climate change. There are hundreds of GCF projects, many already in the implementation phase. In the longer version of this paper, I focus on several of these: rural electrification in Senegal, Green Cities Initiative in Tunisia and several other countries, and adaptation efforts in Egypt, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Right now, I want to do a deep dive into one of these, Senegal's efforts, which I think help to illustrate both the difficulties faced by developing nations and the creative possibilities in a nation with limited resources. With a GDP per capita of $1,500 in 2019, Senegal is actually much wealthier than its West African neighbors, though of course quite poor in comparison with the US or Europe. Its population of 15.9 million is, in comparison with Michigan, about 50% larger, and its landmass is also larger than Michigan. I'm picking on Michigan as our host for this conference. Therefore, it's not surprising that Senegal depends almost entirely on foreign investment to run its energy sector. Power companies are generally privately owned and sell their electricity to the state grid, Senelec. Solar rural electrification in Senegal is an example of a response to climate change that both saves money while using renewable technology to leapfrog over fossil fuel infrastructure. Currently, Senegal produces most of its electricity via a centralized grid run largely on imported oil and locally produced natural gas. Though a new wind farm opened this year, the largest in West Africa, and it's slated to provide 15% of grid electricity needs. Centralized grids are less efficient for far-flung rural areas where Senegal's abundant sun provides an ideal power supply. A rural electrification project jointly sponsored by the West African Development Bank and the Green Climate Fund is now in process, with a goal of providing electricity to 1,000 rural villages via solar-powered microgrids. The electricity is not free, but financing provides the capital to set up the microgrids, which villagers then use to power lights and charge phones, paying about 5 cents per kilowatt hour. In addition, the World Bank has financed 2 large solar farms for a total of 60 megawatts in central Senegal near Touba. At least as important as these investments by the World Bank and the Green Climate Fund is the fact that Senegal was slated to build a 125 megawatt coal-fired plant with Swedish investment, but recently abandoned this in favor of a plant run on natural gas. While natural gas is still a fossil fuel, it's both locally sourced and produces about half the greenhouse gases as compared to coal. These decisions help to explain how Senegal has been able to reduce its carbon footprint, even while increasing its GDP. We find similar stories in majority Muslim countries across the globe. But let's get real here. On the one hand, there's nothing bad about this tale. Senegal is moving from dependence on foreign oil and coal to cleaner, locally sourced energy. It's extending electricity to rural areas, potentially raising the standard of living among the rural poor and easing pressure on urban areas. But on the other hand, even at its peak in 2011, Senegal only ever produced 32 million tons carbon dioxide equivalent. It is now down to 25. As a comparative, the state of Michigan, with 2/3 the population, has 6 times the carbon footprint. In other words, even if the Senegalese reduced their carbon footprint to 0, it would not make as much of an impact on climate change as Michiganders would if they simply stopped wasting so much energy. Of course, the comparison is unfair, and I'm certainly not advocating cooking our food with wood and charcoal as do most Senegalese. But the fact remains that wealthy countries should be leading the way in effecting a transformation to renewable energy instead of fighting, for example, to keep incandescent light bulbs. Remember, Senegal's entire carbon footprint is 25 million tons carbon dioxide equivalent. But in reversing energy standards for light bulbs last year, the Trump administration is going to increase energy costs by $14 billion a year and generate 38 million tons carbon dioxide annually. That is, if we in the United States simply phased out incandescent bulbs, as we've been trying to do for 10 years now, we would cover the carbon footprint of Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and Guinea combined. The vast size of the US economy may be daunting, but it means that small changes, like light bulbs, have outsized impacts. This is not simply about voting in the upcoming election. It's about getting all the parties, Republicans included, to catch up with their membership and to do what conservative parties across the world have done, recognize the threat of climate change. Climate change needs Center survey. I understand if you have no stomach for politics, but I particularly urge my senior colleagues with the privilege of tenure to support efforts at your institution and in your community to increase solidarity and compel corporate action. In my experience, just a little searching in your religious community or academic department will uncover allies who usually welcome another voice for climate justice. We need to learn to wield the immense wealth that is woven into the very fabric of our institutions. Remember, there's 2 giant solar farms in central Senegal with a 60 megawatt capacity that provide more electricity than the entire city of Touba? They were only possible through international grants from multiple government agencies. But Penn State just built a bigger one, 70 megawatts, that will cover 1/4 of the university's electricity needs. How? It promised a private corporation that it would purchase the power from these panels for the next 20 years, in essence, leveraging its immense annual budget for energy. It costs the university nothing up front, will save millions of dollars, all while ensuring against a rise in energy prices. This happened, in part, because of faculty and student demands, some of which were quite heated. I still work on 9th century manuscripts, but my efforts in the community and the university to teach and respond to climate change have been among the most rewarding in my life. I particularly take inspiration from environmentalists in West Africa and all over the developing world. Imagine doing the math and knowing that whether Senegal bases its electricity on coal or on wind will have virtually no impact on climate change, but doing it anyway. They are making hard decisions now on behalf of future generations, and they inspire me to amplify their efforts wherever I can. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Brockopp. And first, before we go on to the next presenter, I want to point out that the Q&A is now for everyone to view. So you should all now be able to see the Q&A. Thank you so much, Professor Brockopp, again. Our next presenter is Professor Gretel van Wieren of Michigan State University. Professor van Wieren is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Michigan State University, where her courses focus on religion, ethics, and the environment. She is author of 3 books: Listening at Lookout Creek, Nature and Spiritual Practice, Food, Farming, and Religion, Emerging Ethical Perspectives, and Restored to Earth, Christianity, Environmental Ethics, and Ecological Restoration, as well as many articles on the human relationship with the natural world. Professor van Wieren is a recipient of a 2016 Mellon Foundation Humanities Without Walls grant and a 2015 H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest Writing Residency. She received a PhD in Religious Studies from Yale, and as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a large group here from Yale joining us today. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague in my department, Professor van Wieren.
Thanks so much, Mohammed, for the opportunity to be in part of this wonderful conference. I just happened to be here at the Cleveland Cultural Gardens en route to visit my daughter in college in Vermont. She was just let go from quarantine, so en route to do there. So I'm here in the Cleveland Gardens. So this presentation stems from a larger book project that was published in 2019 by Routledge that Mohammed just referenced, Food, Farming, and Religion, Emerging Ethical Perspectives. And in that book, I examine how Abrahamic faith traditions are engaging critical issues in food and agricultural ethics. And in particular, I was interested in looking how religious groups were engaging concrete environmental problems on the ground rather than how doctrines or denominational statements or things like that were treating them. So I had a special focus on community groups and religious community groups. So here I want to specifically focus on the problem of climate change and agricultural production and how a farming initiative within Islamic tradition is tackling it. So let me begin by briefly examining the problem of current agricultural production methods in terms of climate impacts. The International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, breaks down emissions according to carbon dioxide equivalents as follows. 26% comes from energy supply, 19% from industry, 17% from forestry, 13% from agriculture, 8% from residential and commercial buildings, and 3% from waste and wastewater. Yet, as Anna LePay points out in her book, Diet for a Hot Planet, the climate crisis at the end of your fork and what you can do about it, the IPCC figures hide agriculture's true climate footprint. For if we consider the total food process, from production to processing to distribution to consumption to waste, agriculture contributes to the greenhouse gas emissions of all of the above sectors. Add all these slivers together, writes LePay, and the entire global food chain may account for roughly 1/3 of what's heating our planet. Consider just one example cited by LePay: palm oil. Contained in foods from granola bars to crackers to cream cheese to candy bars, as well as numerous health and cleaning products, the growth in the palm industry has been exponential over the past several decades. Palm oil now leads the market in globally traded vegetable oils. Originally produced by small-scale farmers in Western Africa, Dutch colonists and the British introduced palm oil palm oil to Java and Malaysia in the late 19th century. Today, palm oil is mostly grown in Indonesia and Malaysia, where rainforests are being clear-cut and converted to massive palm plantations in order to keep up with global demand. In the process, biodiverse forest ecosystems are being destroyed at record pace, undermining land's natural capacity to absorb carbon, as well as producing more of it. This becomes especially prevalent when considering the draining of the region's peat bogs for palm agricultural purposes. Peatlands represent only 0.02% of ecosystems worldwide, though are incredibly efficient at storing and sequestering carbon. Containing trees that can reach 50 meters tall and hold millions of years of organic matter, when peat bogs are drained and dried up for agricultural purposes, the oxidation process actually begins emitting rather than storing carbon. So powerful at absorbing carbon are peat bogs that if just one peatland area in Indonesia were completely destroyed, the carbon emitted would match that of the entire planet for a year. And then there are the carbon emitting fires lasting at times for months that are more likely to occur when peatlands are drained and dried out. Palm production, as with livestock and other types of agricultural production, is predominantly controlled by the world's largest agribusinesses. Small-scale farmers pushed out as corporations continue to buy up more and more land. 10 companies control 2/3 of palm production in Indonesia, with Archer Daniels Midland and Cargill among the largest. Minnesota-based Cargill is the world's largest importer of palm oil in the United States. More, palm oil containing products, most of which are packaged in plastic that requires additional energy to produce and eventually winds up in the landfill, which produces even more warming gases. Such products can be purchased in virtually every grocery store and gas station, large and small, around the world. Second, consider the burdens and benefits of agriculture's climate impacts. For most of us living in the global north, the climate consequences wrought by agriculture's current practices are minimal compared to those living in the global south. We are, as environmental justice activists remind us, not all in this together in terms of how we directly experience the day-to-day realities of Earth's degradations. The global disparities and injustices associated with climate change are especially acute when we consider future projections about the regions and populations that will be most negatively impacted. Large parts of Africa, small island states, and coastal zones will see extreme weather, flooding, and drought in our lifetime, phenomena we have already begun to witness. For the world's poorest people, cites the Human Development Report on climate change, the effects of climate change could be, quote, apocalyptic. So too, climate change is expected to impact agricultural production variously around the world, with some regions faring much worse and others faring better. Regions in Latin America and Africa, for instance, that rely heavily on rainfall for agriculture will see significant reduction in crop yields. By 2020, some regions in Africa are expected to see crop reduction of up to 50%. Some high latitude temperate regions are nonetheless expected to see increases in crop yields with rising temperatures. In some rain-fed agricultural areas in North America, for instance, crop yields are expected to increase 5 to 20%. Even though data predicting climate impacts on agriculture in regions in the global south is limited, making wider generalizable difficulty, what is clear from the data is just how much harder hit will be the world's southern regions. Lastly, let us look at one farming initiative that is seriously considering the problem of climate and what needs to be done agriculturally and perhaps spiritually to mitigate it. Farming God's Way, as it is called, is a project based on climate-friendly farming developed in sub-Saharan Africa with faith groups working on land and water conservation issues. Spearheaded by the Alliance of Religions and Conservation, ARC, the ARC began working in 2010 with Christian, Muslim, and Hindu groups in 11 African countries, launching a long-term environmental action plan in 2012 in Nairobi. Farming God's Way grew out of this initiative and has since been enacted by Christian and Muslim groups across sub-Saharan Africa. The method combines climate-smart, conservation-based approaches to agriculture that are widely promoted throughout Africa with religious teachings about care for the earth. The Muslim Farming God's Way program, titled Islamic Farming, is spelled out in a training manual organized according to 6 P's based on the promises of Allah: planning, prepare, plant, provide, protect, and produce. Rooted in historical farming methods that were developed during the Islamic agricultural revolution in North Africa, the manual draws on the Arabic literary genre, the books of Falaha, a compilation of hundreds of volumes on agriculture that have only recently been discovered in various places throughout the Muslim world, including Iraq, Egypt, and Yemen. The books describe a scientific approach to agriculture and cover the topics of botany, agronomy, horticulture, and animal husbandry. Echoing what today is referred to as alternative, biodynamic, organic, sustainable, or regenerative farming, Muslim agronomists during this time period stressed the importance of balancing the elements of soil, water, air, and manure composting. 4 concerns characterized early Islamic agriculture: rules on land ownership and labor rights, irrigation methods, improved farming techniques, and the introduction of new crops. Many of these concerns, states the Islamic Farming Manual, translate today's agriculture context in sub-Saharan Africa. Islamic rules on land ownership and labor rights approach to land ownership, where men and women, who today 70% of farmers in Africa are women, can own and farm their own land. The spread of Islam through the Middle East and North Africa meant that Muslim communities inherited ancient irrigation systems that they then worked to repair and extend with methods that used a well-like water management system that did not require a pump, but used gravity to transport large amounts of water across hot, arid landscapes, a system that could become increasingly valuable given global water shortages. Islamic farming is guided by the following Quranic principles: God consciousness, reliance on Allah, prayers, repentance, and charity. Islamic farming emphasizes climate smart organic farming with an emphasis on creating a farm as an integrated, self-contained unit. It stresses the need to, quote, know your soil before planting, and gives hands-on tips for testing the soil's chemical pH by, say, mixing in vinegar to see if it bubbles. Keeping livestock is recommended as a way to fertilize and recycle nutrients on fields and provide milk and meat for a family's diet. Animals, states the manual, should always be well cared for. No-till methods are preferred, and the manual gives instructions for how to dig planting holes and build a composting operation. Mechanical tillage is not endorsed in the manual, as it disturbs the soil and is less efficient than no-till. There should be a high quality of work, it states, when it comes to preparing and planting one's farm. Quote, an important message of Islamic farming is that our farm should reflect our taqwa and the order and glory of Allah's creation. 1/3 of the farm should be legumes, it states, which are excellent nitrogen fixers and increase soil fertility. Roots, shoots, and fruits should be rotated. Pests should be managed naturally by building the healthiest possible soil. Burning is not an option in Islamic farming, as it is a short-term solution and will not ultimately build the health of soil. Collect seeds by letting the healthiest plants flower and dry out, and then harvesting the seeds. It will save a lot of money, states the manual. It concludes with a spiritual message about waste. Allah has given us abundant resources, and we should not be wasteful. This is why we do not burn crop residues. It would be wasting. Similarly, we do not want to waste water. We also do not want to waste the time that Allah has given us. We should be on time with our planning and with our preparing of holes, with planting, providing, and protecting. To conclude, Farming God's Way provides an interesting and instructive example of how some religious groups are partnering with agricultural practitioners to develop programs that meet both practical and spiritual needs as a way to adapt to climate change. It is significant for its emphasis on farmer and religious education and for its itinerant character. Reminiscent of George Washington Carver's Jessup wagon, which Carver called a movable school, for how it traveled from community to educate on agricultural matters, Farming God's Way provides a model that is replicable among climate conscious faith groups in various locales. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Van Wieren.
The point you're raising is really important, and this is one of the reasons why I focus on the Green Climate Fund. World Bank and certainly has a history of being involved in projects that, as you say, don't take local knowledge into account. But the Green Climate Fund explicitly takes as part of its principles, looking at indigenous knowledge and demanding that every project assess its own environmental and social impact. And you can see this, it's very transparent on the website. You can go through every project and every proposal before it's approved has to submit an extensive impact statement. So all of that is part of this. In addition, they're one of the few international aid organizations that take gender into account. So they're looking, and that's one of the reasons why, again, the microgrid idea is something that they're supporting. The giant wind turbines, that's not a project from the Green Climate Fund, but I think it is important for us to look at all of these, and it's one of the reasons why I raised also the issue of the choice of natural gas versus coal. So on the one hand, we absolutely want to promote those projects that do take all these things into account. On the other hand, I think we have to be very pragmatic in looking at the decision-making process in these countries and to see that, you know, sure, we can talk about a microgrid that's going to affect these 1,000 villages, but at the same time, they're building a coal-fired power plant, right? So those choices to go from coal to natural gas, I think, are also terribly important for us to keep track of. This has to do, I think, something that Kutsia mentioned also, that we need to be complex in our analysis. And so it's one of the reasons why I also made a hand wave gesture to this notion that this is all sorts of injustice that are tied up in this. This is also Black Lives Matter. This is also central issues of colonialism. All of this is tied up, and we need to think about that very in a very complex way. So thank you so much for that. I have a question for you, if I may, Mohammed.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's this, you alluded to the problem of freedom of press in Morocco, and how in a vacuum of solid information, almost conspiracy theories start to develop as people talk about this garbage issue, for example. And so that's, for me, a really interesting complexity as we think about interfacing. And this is, of course, not only in Morocco, right? Think of all the QAnon in the US, and now in Germany, apparently QAnon's taking off, right? So this role of conspiracy theories of lack of knowledge. And one of the reasons, if I can just be precise on this, when we're talking about something like the air, we seem to be set up for a notion that it's impossible for human beings to affect the actual makeup of the atmosphere. And so we can talk about Anthropocene, but the reality of that is very hard to grasp. So in the absence of knowledge, how we fill these things in with our own presumptions, conspiracy theories, our own local knowledge. I'm curious as to how that works in the Moroccan context specifically. Thank you.
Do you want me to answer or should we collect other questions?
No, go ahead, that's fine.
Sure. The short answer is that I don't know because as I mentioned, my preliminary research was preliminary, and my current ability to collect research in the way, at least that I had initially imagined, is somewhat on hold. But that being said, I think that there's been a lot of research in political science, which is my field, which I'm slightly more familiar with. I'm sure communication studies and other sort of fields deal with this too, but conspiracy theories is a really interesting field of study. And I think that it's important to, not be dismissive of, which is why the point I was trying to make when comparing the two sides of that story that I received, because I don't think that the one was unfounded, because there's like so much this concern with toxicity. There was, speaking of the connection with Black Lives Matter, there in 2014 or maybe ongoing, there was this in Kenitra, which is just north of Rabat, the capital, there was this sort of I Can't Breathe campaign against pollution from a factory. And so I think the concerns around toxicity are very important, whether or not the actual, so like tracing people's reactions to different things, I think is important. And I think that understanding sort of the values and experiences with the state, at least for my project, is like taking those reactions to conspiracy, what we might term conspiracy theories, seriously, and seeing. I think that you're right in saying something like the air is really, it might seem amorphous or hard for us to pinpoint who is responsible, but I think when you actually talk to people, they often, I'm just reading this book called Waste Siege. Actually, I have it right here. It just won the Horani Award at Mesa. It's really, really great. And the author talks about how individuals in Palestine, even though like issues around waste are really hard to point down like a person to, and as you said, they're connected and complex, they're often like individuals themselves often do pick someone to be responsible. And so I think more ethnographic research, more interview data or survey data or whatever that is, to like take seriously and understand where individuals are placing blame and responsibility. The short answer is that I don't know, but I think that we have to take both how people understand the problem and how people understand who's responsible for the problem seriously.
Thank you, Lauren. Professor Talili?
Thank you so much. I've learned so much from all the presentations, and I wanted actually to ask questions about all of them, but I know there isn't time for this. So I will focus just on one presentation, the last one. Thank you so much, Professor Sheh. This was such a profound presentation that you have offered, and it was quite engaging, you know. So it's because I am quite engaged, actually, that I'm going to ask my questions. The points that you have discussed, many of them are at the core of my own research. Let me first go to the question whether the Quran is an anthropocentric text. The Quran is believed, obviously, by most of its readers, Muslim and non-Muslim, modern and pre-modern, to be an anthropocentric text. I do, however, argue that this is because we approach the Quran anthropocentrically rather than because the Quran is, in fact, anthropocentric. You have pointed out 2 points today. One of them, the verse which says, "We have created for you everything." Well, yes, the Quran does that, but I think that question should be pushed a little bit further. First of all, why does the Quran say this? After all, the Quran defines itself as a scripture directed to humankind. It is speaking to humankind. It's not speaking to others. So it is presenting things from humankind's perspective, right? Like highlighting what is relevant to humankind's experience, what will make a difference for them. This is not, you know, like when the Quran says this, it does not actually say, "I have created this only for humankind." You have also brought up, and elsewhere, of course, it says, you know, like for example, the land, he has created it for all creatures, the verse that is in Surah Al-Rahman, which was cited today. And the other point that you have brought up, the theme of taskhir, we have subjugated everything to you, like, you know, again, I think that taking this theme and using it to argue that the Quran is an anthropocentric text is again something that is based on a selective approach to the Quran. Because one of the most prominent verses, in fact, that says this, you know, it's in Surah number 14, Surah Ibrahim, and it talks about like the taskhir, the subjugation of so many other things. But then the end of that verse, it says, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَظَلُومٌ كَفَّارٌ. Right? Like, so this is not about a human exceptionalism at all. It's about other things. And I feel that, you know, like, it's quite important actually to address all of these questions with more depth, you know, like this selective approach to the Quran, which, you know, I'm not arguing that you are doing this. I feel that the tradition has overwhelmingly done this. And I think this is a flawed approach to the Quran. And as long as we don't address it, maybe our approach, not just like to the environment, but even to, like it even creates theological problems, you know, not just environmental problems. And I see like a very strong interconnection between theological and environmental problems. So I feel that this, I mean, I challenge this reading in my book and in many other works, you know, including today's presentation. In fact, in the longer version of my presentation today, I challenge Fadl Rahman for his anthropocentric reading of the Quran. He's not, you know, like it's again, what he does is like so many others, you know, the selective approach to the Quran. About science, I really love the point that you make here about, you know, it's basically your analyzing readings of science, of the West, and all of that. And I'm so much totally for that. You know, like, essentialism is not, it's really a weakness in the way we approach any topic. And everything is quite complex, far more complex than we tend to agree at first, we tend to kind of see at first glance. Nonetheless, I will say this, you know, I'm in total agreement with you about the West, so I'm not going to challenge that at all. Actually, I thank you very much for making that point. I think we Muslims nowadays are as guilty of problematic and, you know, like attitudes toward the environment as anyone else. About science, however, there's something which I feel is, which, like, I feel is something that is, I don't know like how to say, is problematic about modern science. You know, it's not about science in general, it is about a certain approach, a certain epistemology that is unique to modern science, and this begins with the Renaissance. This alliance between scientific research and capitalism, the way that science, you know, like Lynn White has pointed this out, you know, like the way that science in modern culture, you know, like beginning with the Enlightenment, has become at the service of capitalism. So what science does, it's basically not this admiration of the natural phenomena, like trying to understand them for their own sake, appreciate them for what they are, you know, which in fact the Quran and probably like many other kind of religious texts encourage. It's science that is being instrumentalized, and it is instrumentalized to do what? To promote the well-being of human beings, right? So what capitalism is doing at the concrete dimension of nature, science is doing at the abstract dimension, you know, and the two are in alliance to create this impact, this environmental impact. And I believe this is something that is not just my imagination. I think this relationship exists, and I hate to generalize. I don't want to say that all science is this, but which scientific research obtains funds to be conducted. You know, it's only that the scientific research that can find funding from corporations, basically, right? The selective approach that Muslims have towards science, you know, yes, I agree about that. But nonetheless, you know, like I think some Muslims offer deeper critical insights that should not be dismissed as just, you know, being like selective in their approach, or not, you know, like when you talk, like, yes, science has done a few things for us, but it is at the same time kind of directing our gaze away from other things that are important, you know, like the other things that we may be able to appreciate in life, you know. In fact, I think what I'm critical about in the scientific epistemology in general, it's this heavy reliance on reason, which in itself is a very anthropocentric thing, because it elevates the human being above the other creatures and it instrumentalizes the other creatures. So here we do deal with some foundational notions that I feel need to be addressed, you know, and not just dismissed. Muslims who are not just Muslims, you know, in fact, environmentalists and environmental ethicists across traditions who are critical of certain aspects of science, you know, they are doing this for very legitimate reasons. And I don't think it is, you know, I think this should be addressed and not be dismissed as just, you know, not responsible enough. You have said like a lot of interesting things. I don't want to monopolize the floor today. So, but I mean, maybe we'll be in conversation later on. But I thank you. You know, like it's such a profound presentation, and it's quite engaging. Thank you.
Thank you. Zia would like to respond.
I don't know where to begin. Thank you very much. I'm not a professor, so my this, you know, climate change is something I feel very deeply about, and these are just my observations. When I was reading, I've attended a couple of lectures, I've read some pamphlets, and so I gathered all of this, and these are my reflections and observations from what I have gathered. I actually don't think there is a problem if Quran is, or the idea of anthropocentrism is in the Quran. And I think for my reading, and I think there are, you know, we can agree to disagree on this, but there are different approaches to the Quran and how it has been interpreted or read over centuries and even today. So if you know, if there, and I'm not the only one, there are others as well who have read the idea of anthropocentrism in the Quran. And what I'm saying in my paper, and I know these are very preliminary thoughts, and again, as I said, I'm not an Arabist. I don't have knowledge of the Arabic language, and I have used Rahman quite extensively in my paper, that the problem is not that whether the idea is there. Like you said, that, you know, God says that I've created this world for you, but then he's also put responsibility on us how we treat the world, how we treat animals. And I think you can't just talk about one thing and not talk about the other aspect of the responsibility that we have of how we treat this world. So that was one. You talked about science as well. You agreed with the West notion that I had. As far as science is concerned, I think science is a very vast field. And, you know, you cannot journalize science in any way. There are theoretical physicists whose sole purpose in life is just to marvel at the world and discover what's out there. So I mean, if that's what I think. But if there's anything else, I don't know if I've missed out. I mean, I was trying to follow what you were saying. But please.
No, thank you. I mean, that should be enough, and perhaps it's a conversation that we can continue after.
We can, definitely, sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. By the way, Professor Talili, at one point you were mentioning Surah 14 of the Quran. You said that there were these passages that say that God, you know, subjugated this and that and several things. And at the end, you said something in Arabic, which I'm assuming that you would translate it as, and the human being is ungrateful and maybe oppressive to themselves or something along those lines. Is that an okay translation?
Right. Actually, it says, now I remember, it's Jahul, Kafar, and Jahul is haughty, although it is usually like translated as ignorant. I think it's more haughty, and Kafar is ungrateful. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you for my attention.
Yes. Again, I'd like to invite the attendees to type questions in the Q&A. It's remarkably silent, but anyway, Professor Van Wieren, yes. And actually, I have a question for you as well, Professor Van Wieren, but go ahead.
I just wanted to comment on the discussion between Professor Tilley and Shah. I think the question of the role of science in religious environmentalism and environmental ethics more broadly, and just in environmental discourse in general, is never been more important than has never been more important. And I think the question of the various epistemologies around science and how science is interpreted and incorporated as a source in religious environmentalism, I mean, that's a very general comment, but I think all those questions around views of the mechanization of nature and where those kind of views come from. Do they in fact come from modern science? Do they come from certain Enlightenment philosophies or medieval philosophies? Those questions of the source of a view of nature, where nature can then be dominated and destroyed for human development, I think are just incredibly important and interesting. So I'm really glad that that conversation, you know, I could talk about this for a really, really long time, because I think the question, and going back to Professor Tilley, your focus on wonder, I just think is so incredibly important. And of course, wonder can come from science and from modern science, as Professor Shaw points out. At the same time, I agree with Professor Tilley that on balance, there has been a view of the mechanization of nature through modern science and economics and so on and so forth. So it's also been very destructive. So I'll end there. A really wonderful conversation to keep having.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Van Wieren. Would anyone like to respond to that?
Just a very short note that I agreed. I think that it's such an interesting topic, and also to the points that, you know, there's science, you know, that we're painting with a pretty broad brush here. And I think that historians of science like Lorraine Daston, who writes explicitly about wonder and sort of their creation of the idea of objectivity in the first place, sort of that we tend to take for granted when we talk about science, and sort of like Bruno Latour and this sort of, I think a lot of scientists who are actually in labs and practicing science are more skeptical and curious than perhaps we tend to paint them as, which in and of itself is perhaps an interesting point for further research.
Thank you. We do have a comment here. Oh, go ahead, Professor Brockopp.
So just on this one point, you know, it's a real joy to teach general humanities courses because you get students who are in the sciences, in business, and all kinds of areas, and the opportunity to free them to think about their personal ethics, what's important to them, to encourage them to think about the awesomeness of their subjects of study, and it is, and they are often so trained to leave that part of themselves outside of the classroom. So those of us who teach have a genuine opportunity to complexify these issues and to allow them, because you're right, actual scientists, I mean, I know many scientists, Victoria Braithwaite, a dear friend who just died last year, an animal scientist who was absolutely in love with the world. And it was that love of the world that drove her work. So we can really reach a lot of young scientists in this way and offer them, as humanists, as ethicists, offer them the possibility of thinking these things through.
Thank you, Professor Brockopp.
Yes,
please.
Yes. I think also, you know, I think, like I say in the paper as well, we need to make a distinction, and especially the approach in my paper is in terms of when we're educating or talking to young Muslim people. When we create this, when we talk of science in this way, in a very selective way, and incremented, that the scientists are somehow implicated in this climate change and environmental degradation, over time, we have to be very careful, because they see this dichotomy between science and Islam. And I've been to a number of talks where there have been Muslim young people sitting in audience, and they were not able to see through that. And I find that very difficult. I find that very worrying, actually. So that's the position that I was coming from.
Thank you, Sia. Professor Brockopp.
Just specifically in response to that, I bring scientists into the classroom and I ask them about their commitments, what drives them. So, I don't teach in mosques, but it would be possible to bring in your scientist members of the mosque and ask them to explain the role of religion in what they do, whether physicians or neuroscientists or whatever it is. I think oftentimes scientists are bound in their own cultures from speaking about their personal commitments, that it's not seen as scientific, very problematically, but this is the case. And so giving them the opportunity to speak, I think, could be very inspiring to young Muslims.
Thank you, Professor Brockopp. In the comment in the Q&A, we have an interesting comment from Dr. Janine Janoudi. The native cultures have a much closer understanding of the human nature balance than religions that have been made to fulfill colonial politics. Very interesting observation indeed. I do want to ask Professor Van Wieren a question. You mentioned the Islamic farming manual and book, and in the Q&A there was some discussion about that as well, I see. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that book or that manual. Oh, and you are muted, by the way.
Can you just say it again? You broke up a minute. I couldn't hear the full question.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, the Islamic farming book. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that book.
So it was so as I said in the presentation, it was recently discovered. It was one of the sources that the Islamic farming manual drew on heavily in describing the kind of historical precursors for what they were doing in terms of grounding this kind of agricultural approach in more ancient or pre-modern Islamic thinking. And so in terms of what I know in terms of how it talked about it, is that the literary genre was a compilation of hundreds of volumes on agriculture that were discovered in various places in the Muslim world. I haven't read them directly because I don't know Arabic, and because also my understanding as they were compiled. I did some digging in terms of the archival kind of how one might be able to read the archival collection itself, and wasn't able to find a lot of clear information on that. Maybe someone here knows more about the kind of archival status in terms of, but I do know it was a very, very large body of literature that had very specific and detailed information about, as I said, agronomy, botany, horticulture, animal husbandry. And to me, if I was working in the field of Islam and the environment and had all the capacity of language and so on and so forth, this would be an incredible kind of resource to explore. And I know some thinkers that cover, and Professor Chalili, you probably could say a lot more about this, but thinkers like Richard Foltz and others that have worked on animals and agriculture have done work with this collection. And I don't know, again, maybe Professor Chalili, others that are doing work specifically in environmental ethics around the use but mostly what I know of them is how the manual incorporated them, which I thought was really interesting, you know, as a religious source, that in addition to the Quran, which obviously is the most important source in Islamic environmental ethics, the fact that they so heavily drew on this other source, you know, I found really interesting methodologically as well.
Interesting. Thanks so much. Let me open. Oh, we have another question. Oh, Professor Brockopp, please go ahead.
Just quickly in response to that, I am guessing that these are not single sources, but as you suggested, extractions from books of Islamic law, as well as pharmacopoeias and other medical texts. But what's really helpful about this, and I think so terribly important, is that we often look to a kind of commentary or intellectual tradition when talking about these things. And what you're focusing on, and what this book is focusing on, is the practical lived experience. And we do have sources that tell us about the way that Muslims addressed the land, dealt with the land, thought about the non-human creatures of the world in a very practical, hands-on way, and not just through the theoretical lenses of Quran and Quran commentary.
We have a bunch of questions in the Q&A with only 4 or 5 minutes to go, but here we go. I'll give it a shot. Professor Brockopp, can you please tell us a bit about the Community Conversations programming in Pennsylvania? This is from Deborah Margolis of MSU Libraries.
Yes, sorry, I was just reading the things. I will be happy to share some materials on that. I can probably just easily give that to you and as a resource for the conference. But briefly, we took as the example the National Issues Forum discussions on climate change. And looking at those, one of the things in our area that was problematic is they all assumed that climate change, everybody participating understood that climate change was happening. That is not the case in rural Pennsylvania, where there's deep skepticism. And so what we did is we changed things around a little bit and actually went out to communities and you know, first of all, starting with social structures that already exist, whether it's an Elks Club, whether it's a you know, different. We have something called the Grange here, which is a agricultural club. So working with social groups that already exist and getting them to allow us to come in. We worked through the public libraries in Center County to do this. And simply open up a conversation, a listening session on climate change, which is not directed, but which is eliciting responses from people. What we found out was that again, there's this deep skepticism. They do not want to hear what Penn State experts have to tell them about what's happening in their world. But much as the other commentator was saying about indigenous populations having local knowledge, in fact, our indigenous populations, well, not indigenous, but I mean, our local rural populations see the changes in agriculture. They see the changes in the forest. They understand that these changes are happening and that they're problematic. Getting them to just start talking about that with one another is immensely beneficial and raises questions and allows us to start then an information exchange, which has been very positive.
Thank you. We have a question here from Asima Haji. I have a question for Professor Shah. How does she see this dichotomy of science and religion play out in the lives of Muslim communities? Can she give examples? My interest is, especially as a parent, I have questions about stem cells and the study of the field by Muslims. I hope this makes sense.
I'd gone to a talk a couple of years ago where this gentleman who was a Muslim, he was giving a presentation on science. And he somehow or the other, and I could never understand by the end of it, he was able to prove that penicillin, I think one of the most amazing inventions, discoveries that has happened, was somehow a very bad thing that had happened to humanity, because it was used in livestock breeding and keeping them, alive. They would be, and that was a bad thing. And he did not highlight the other side of how penicillin was saving lives, in medical care and all of that. And I think it's about focus. And I think even in my paper as well, what I'm saying is that I'm not saying that science and the use of that science, technology and through commerce, that it hasn't been used in a negative way, but we have to also highlight how it has really benefited human beings and the world at large as well. And so creating this balance, I think, in our when we talk and when we discuss these issues, I think is important.
Thank you so much. I would like to encourage the panelists to take a look at the Q&A. There are a bunch of comments and questions there. Here's a comment from Professor Salah Hassan. It seems to me that there are at least two distinct threads in the papers and the discussion. One, how have majority Muslim states developed or not environmental policy in the face of climate change? And two, what are the Islamic philosophical, legal, and theoretic principles that can guide Muslims in their relationship to the environment? The first is really a question of wealth, power, and sovereignty relative to food, water, and energy. The second is much more abstract. Well, and with that provocative, very interesting comment, I'm going to actually end it here officially because it is 12 o'clock. But I would like to invite panelists to stick around for a few more minutes. We'll maybe go another, if you'd like, we can hang out for another 5 minutes to chat. But this officially ends the second panel. So a big round of applause to our panelists. Thank you to you all. It's been really interesting, a very stimulating first day. And tomorrow is the second and final day. And again, it's 8 to 12. We may finish, well, yeah, it'll probably be 8 to 12. We probably will finish around that time. Because as I mentioned before, we're going to have a 20-minute sort of open discussion following the last panel because one of the presenters had to withdraw. So thank you all once again. I'll stick around for another 5 minutes. We can keep this going if you have any questions or like to chat. Thank you to all.
Response to Professor Shah. Thank you again. I mean, this is very thought-provocative. So I'm quite thankful to you. But I mean, what I see here is that you have precisely given an anthropocentric response to a question that could go both ways, right? So yes, if penicillin has been developed in, like penicillin is saving human lives, but what about the lives that were sacrificed? Are we allowed to sacrifice those? Like, who gives us the permission to do that, right? No, now, of course, penicillin is there, and I wouldn't say that we cannot use it, but as we move forward, as we try, like now, for example, there is research on chimeras, trying to develop neurological, cells in animals, right? Because this can eventually or potentially help, say, give us deeper understanding of the human mind and cure certain, mental diseases or brain diseases in humans, whatever. I mean, so here there is research that is going to make the lives of certain animals unbearable. We are going to change them. Who gives us that's exactly the anthropocentric approach that I see in science and that I see in like those who read religious texts in an anthropocentric manner, right? We see that, we believe that the text is about us. So, and even if I were not to apply that, so you mentioned earlier the two principles of dhulm and taqwa. Isn't it dhulm to compromise the life of another being so that I save a human life? I know, I mean, if I were to save the life of a relative, of course I will try to do everything for them. But does this give me the right to go and take the life of another human being, for example, to save the life of my own relative? All of us are going to say a big no to that. But we do say yes to it when we apply it to animals, right? And to other sentient creatures. And this is where it comes, science does not equip us with enough sensitivity and actually is not equipped ethically to answer these questions. We have to go to religious texts. And I really thank the parent who asked about this, and I admire the students who ask you these questions. again, I go back to the point that Professor Brockopp made earlier, when we should ask our students about their ethical commitments. But part of that ethical commitment should be, what gives us the right to destroy the life, or, like to destroy or to compromise the well-being of another being so that I can save a human life. I don't think we have that right being on Earth, and it is dhulm when we do that. So that's, yeah.
And just Professor de Longbos mentioned Laudato Si, which is Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change. He has a passage that gives me chills every time I read it, which talks about the loss of these non-human creatures. And what he says about that is that precisely as you're saying with the Quran, and this is also the case in the Bible, that they are in communication with God, and by their destruction, they can no longer sing their praises to God or give their messages to us. And then he says explicitly, we have no such right. So this, and I think this is what humanities can do. We can reframe these issues. And by reframing this in terms of what our rights and responsibilities are vis-a-vis non-human and non-communicative and water and stones, I think that really is a profound reordering of students' conceptions of their place in the universe.
Professor Shah, I don't know if you wanted to add something.
I don't think I'm saying that we can use or misuse the lives of other creatures to save our own lives. Science invents and discovers the world, and how you use that science, you have to use ethical parameters within which you can use that science. And I don't think there can be any disagreement over that. And I think this, like I always said, there need to be a balance of how you present science to anyone. Penicillin has its uses. You're not misusing how you use that. If you use that to keep livestock healthy, but they're living in very cramped circumstances, they're sick, and you're giving them antibiotics to keep them alive so that you can feed human beings, definitely that's not ethical. And I don't think there's no way I'm saying that that's an ethical thing. But the penicillin itself, in keeping us healthy to fight bacteria, there can't be any disagreement, I think, over that either.
I think maybe because of the time, we'll have to, maybe this is really a great conversation, but I think maybe because of the time, we'll have to maybe continue offline, if you will. But I think this is something worth considering for maybe the closing, the open discussion at the end. I think that's we might have a good kind of follow-up conversation on that. But I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to spend this morning with us. Well, morning for us here in Michigan State, in East Lansing. And I'll see you all in 20 hours. Have a wonderful day. Take care.
For this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mohammed.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, everybody.
Everyone.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.
Firdausi, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you,
Bye.
Mary.